we are talking the British creature feature, The Young Cannibals. This one is directed and written by Chris Carr and Sam Fowler. Now, will the Young Cannibals be fine young cannibals, or will they be less than a one-hit wonder? Let's discuss. So what is the plot about, first of all? Well, I've got to say, the actual plot has an interesting hook. So we have a group of kind of young adults, and one of their number has been in psychiatric care because they had a suicide attempt. So they decide to kind of break her out of this kind of psychiatric hospital and take her out camping on her birthday to kind of lift her spirits and such. And we have some of her friends, her kind of boyfriends, her brother. It's kind of like mixture of people. And they're off kind of in the woods camping, doing camping stuff. And they are kind of given these burgers by this local man who I think they have to kind of sign, he obviously owns the land or something. And he gives them these burgers, but what they don't know is these burgers are actually made from human flesh. And there happens to be a monster in this woods that actually specifically goes after people who are cannibals, who eat human flesh. So this kind of essentially almost puts a target on these guys' back. They're lost in the woods, and they have this creature hunting them that literally has kind of like got this homing signal because it can tell that they have eaten human flesh and are therefore kind of cannibals. So it makes for an interesting kind of cat and mouse game. What will happen? You have to watch the movie to find out. So let's discuss first of all what works with The Young Cannibals. So I think it's a fantastically original hook for a movie. I don't remember seeing a setup quite like this before, and I've got to say it's a great idea. The execution, we'll come on to that. But I've got to say the idea is good, and it's certainly an interesting setup, and you're thoroughly kind of engaged on the kind of that initial setup in the movie. I've got to say there's some fairly strong directorial choices here. These two guys are obviously clearly movie fans, particularly that of Edgar Wright, who I feel is very much an influence of these guys. And the early parts of this kind of the movie, before we kind of get to the kind of the monster scenes, they're almost played for kind of comedy value. Things like we have zooms with kind of sound effects and kind of stuff like this. It reminds you of the work of Edgar Wright, Shaun of the Dead, Spaced, things like that. It makes for kind of quite a fun directorial style. Admittedly, I don't feel it's maybe original. They are aping someone else's style. But nonetheless, it shows that these guys have at least, trying to kind of have a little bit of a niche market by having this kind of like, slightly kind of like hyper reality and things like that. The actual practical effects when we kind of see our monster, I've got to say, are quite fun for a kind of a low budget movie. I think they do a decent enough job here of some practical makeup. There are some kind of like fairly kind of good gore shots here, excuse me, here and there that I feel are pretty effective. And there are some characters here who I actually quite liked and were played a little bit against type. For example, we have, it all ends up how you think it will if you watch any type of horror movies, but initially I always think, there's kind of like a girl here who, clearly isn't expected to go hiking through the woods, and she's kind of wearing her, her fashion-conscious shoes and stuff like that, and that becomes a plot point. But I thought, do you know what, that's probably true. There would be some girl who comes up all glammed up and stuff, not expecting to have to go running through her life in the woods. She's wearing impractical shoes, and you've got like, a guy who ends up being a little bit cowardly, but he's not necessarily killed off sort of straight away, things like this. So there are some kind of like character choices here which I feel are fairly interesting. However, there are some issues with some characters, which we'll come on to. But let's talk about maybe some of the negative things here. Now, I've mentioned I like the idea of this story, and that is true. However, I feel the actual narrative thread throws logic out the window because there are so many plot holes in this movie, and it just doesn't make sense. Now, I don't want to give away too many specifics because I do not want to spoil plot points in this movie for you, but I am going to talk about maybe one character just to give you a flavour of what I'm talking about. So the guy who is the guy who gives the burgers, this older guy who we see in a kind of a prologue. Now, we know he's a cannibal from the prologue, so that's not a spoiler. So he knows this monster specifically eats cannibals. So number one, why is he still a cannibal if he knows that they are there's a monster that specifically eats cannibals? He is in the middle of the UK. It's not like he's kind of like in some wilderness or something, which the prologue alludes to. That doesn't make sense. So why is he still a cannibal? Why is he then living next to the woods where there is this monster lurking around there that specifically eats cannibals? When he gives these burgers to this group of people, one of them who is a vegan, but this guy has never met that group of people. How does he know that this guy hasn't eaten the burgers? Doesn't, there are so many just little plot points here, and that's just one scene. And there are so many things here that aren't explained, that don't make sense, and it's that the movie simply asks you to turn off your brain. Now, that might be okay, but to me, you can get away with it a couple of times. But this movie is littered with just plain bonkers decisions. I mean, this takes place within the UK, and these guys are getting lost in the forest. They don't seem like they're that far deep in the forest and things like that. There's just so many plot holes and things that don't make sense in this movie. Let's talk about the characters. Now, I've mentioned I quite like some of the character choices here, but however, there are some negatives to that as well. I feel the person who ends up, without telling you who this is, without the person who ends up being our main protagonist is severely underdeveloped. In actual fact, some of the secondary characters actually I feel they have a little bit more characterization than our primary protagonist. It's a really bizarre choice. So you don't really ever feel that connected to the person who becomes our central protagonist, shall we say. And that character feels particularly underdeveloped. And in fact, a lot of the information that we know about this character are told by other people. So there's really very little emotional connection to that central character, without saying who lives and who dies, essentially. I feel the movie, although it is clearly influenced by, these filmmakers are influenced by a lot of genre filmmaking, shall we say. I feel it wears its influences a little bit too obviously. The movie is, like I've said, it clearly has some directorial influences from Edgar Wright, but the movie also is you'll very much get the sense of Predator, you'll get the sense of the Descent, and I feel the filmmakers here are a little bit lacking in their own voice, and they're too busy trying to replicate movies before it rather than try and do its own thing. And I have to say as well, I feel the movie outstays its welcome. To a point, it just gets a little bit samey after a while. I mean, the setup is good. Some of our characters are particularly quite likeable and quite interesting. But then it focuses on maybe characters who, like I've said, we don't necessarily care about as much, and it ends up, there's only so much running around in the woods being chased by a monster that we can take, really, and until it becomes a little bit samey after a certain period of time. And I've got to say, my mind started to wander as we head towards the final act of this movie. Overall, I will say there is some stuff to enjoy here. The setup is very strong. There are some likeable characters, and the effects are good. There are some interesting decisions made by some character choices, but this movie, to me, it needed another rewrite. I think I just don't think there was enough going on. I feel some of the ideas that it had were squandered. Some things simply just weren't explained and just doesn't make sense. And this movie needed to have a little bit more time done on the script, I feel, to make it more of a cohesive and coherent plot, because it just falls apart. So on a visual style, it is fun. I've got to be honest with you, it reminded me a little bit of Don't F in the Woods. I've got to watch what I say now because my videos are getting flagged. But yeah, it was okay, but I've got to say it ends up being relatively average when it's all shaped down. So I'm going to give this one a 5 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment, and I shall look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.